What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some games you should not 100%, because recently I've been playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and when I decided to play that game, a lot of people told me, hey, you might not want to 100% that one, it's a lot, and I am slowly but surely finding out why they were saying that. But that got me to thinking about other gaming experiences that were, in fact, I would say, hurt a little by the 100% process, even if they are games that I enjoy. And the last time I spoke about this turned out to be a few years ago, which surprised me a little bit. All the way back in 2023, I would have sworn it was more recent than that, but realistically, I've reviewed like 100 games since then, so I thought it would be fun to do a little update on this. But right here at the beginning, it's important to make a distinction between games I think are bad and 100% that I don't think are fun to do necessarily. In fact, most of the games on this list I enjoy quite a bit. On a previous version of this, I even put my favorite game, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, because while I love that game, trying to 100% it would be a nightmare for 99% of people. So with all of that said, let's finally jump into this and talk about these games individually. First and foremost, we have Final Fantasy XVI, in fact, a game that came to PC last year, so I had a chance to review it, as this is in fact a PC channel, and this is a game that I think has a great story and a great core experience, if you like action games, that is. But the reason I think it's a bad time to 100% is actually all of the side content, which is dreadfully boring. The side quests of this game are simply not it. Whereas the main story is this big spectacle of a story telling this gripping tale between all of these nations and the bond between these brothers, the side quests unfortunately feel like a different thing entirely, with incredibly lackluster animations where you're usually going to just pick up some little bit of material. In some case, one literally sends you to go get some wood, and that's about the level of depth that most of them have, offering little, if anything, to the world building, and you definitely get the impression that a lot of it is filler. So while you have this great core experience, you then have this pretty bad side stuff that just wasn't fun to engage with. But of course, if you're going to actually 100% this one, you do in fact need to engage with that stuff, and it's not particularly engaging, which is a very similar case for our next title, GoW Ragnarok, another game that came to PC last year, that if you just play for the story and the main experience is a pretty good time, but falls apart with the side stuff. Though I will mention, in the case of this one, I do think Ragnarok fails to hit the highs of the original from the 2018 release. But what really drug the experience down for me was actually Vanaheim. I hated running through that place. It was not fun. Being a dense jungle area, it's probably no surprise that it's a tangled mess of various pathways that all kind of circle back into each other in various forms, and unfortunately it makes navigating the place a bit of a nightmare, which isn't helped by the fact that it's one of the larger areas in the game, and by the time I was finally done with it, I was over it. I hate that place. And if I never see it again, it will be too soon. But then we have one a little bit different, and this is Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, a game I actually enjoyed a lot. Most of that game is a blast to play. It's like a weird fever dream with a whole bunch of nonsense that is genuinely really fun. But would I recommend you 100% it? No, I would not. And that's mostly due to the way that it handled its DLC. Something their most recent venture with Pirate Yakuza made a explicit mention at the end of their preview that they would be adding New Game Plus in a post-launch update that wasn't included in a DLC you had to pay for like Infinite Wealth was. You didn't just get New Game Plus, you had to in fact pay for it as part of a DLC that included an in-game dungeon. Now while that was bad enough, after experiencing that content for myself, if you watch my channel regularly, you might just remember that I made a very specific video about it, which is not something I do extremely often, but that DLC was so bad that it honestly warranted it. Because both the in-game dungeon added as well as New Game Plus are terrible, to be honest. The dungeon that it adds is poor, and by the time you get to New Game Plus, the game's combat actually just completely falls apart, where things had interesting mechanics and the like, and the lead up to that point. Once you get to that stage of the game, combat is basically you entering combat, casting about 3 abilities, and then combat is over because everything is dead. And while that would be one thing if, the game was just a complete redo with all your skills and stuff where enemies weren't scaled up, but they even scale the enemies up, and even then, none of these mechanics really work at that level, with you just decimating absolutely everything. So for me, it was the combination of those two things together, not only putting this stuff behind a paywall to begin with, but also the fact that behind that paywall, it's of pretty poor quality in comparison to everything else about the game, really just did not sit well with me. So while I do recommend the actual game itself, I would not recommend you 100% it. Which brings us to our fourth entry, with something a little bit smaller, and that is Phantom Doctrine. Phantom Doctrine is an espionage TRPG, and as such, it has a lot of cool ideas. Unfortunately though, you've seen pretty much most of those ideas in the first 10 hours, and if you want to 100% it, you've got probably another 70 or 80 to go. And while the idea of putting on disguises and sending your agents in and taking out targets stealthily, sometimes without ever entering combat properly at all, while also brainwashing enemy spies to work for you, that kind of stuff, it's a really fun and engaging time for a little while. But then you're going to start seeing repeat content, and if you want the 100%, you have to play through that game 3 different times, and the differences between those playthroughs will not be enough to make it interesting enough to warrant them, even if there is a little bit of extra story attached. And as such, while I love a lot of the ideas in Phantom Doctrine, it's a game that just runs on for way too long and would have benefited from being scaled back. But then for our final entry, we've got another TRPG, and this is in fact Tactics Ogre. In particular, Reborn in this case, but realistically, any version of this game that includes the Palace of the Dead, a giant sort of mega dungeon in that game that sees you traversing, I think it's 100 floors, if my memory serves me. Now, on the bright side, you can leave and come back from this dungeon, but it is a monumental task tearing through this thing, and that is on top of the multiple ways through the game that already exist via its 3 story paths. And to put that in perspective a little bit more, in fact, of my almost 200 hours of the game, a huge chunk of that, I don't remember exactly how much, was spent specifically on the Palace of the Dead. And while thankfully, if all you care about is the achievements, you only have to do the initial portion of it. Though if you want to reach all the way to the bottom, you're in for a pretty lengthy time, which is why the averages for completion here run like 150 to almost 300 hours for most people. But luckily, because this game has been out for so long and reaches all the way back to some of the beginning of the TRPG genre, or SRPGs if you prefer in this case, there are a ton of guides and help out there for how to actually tackle it, so there is a little bit of help, but generally it's not an experience I would recommend for most people, which is what it's doing on this list. But I think that is pretty much going to wrap it up for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading some comments about other games that it's not well advised that you 100%. You know, outside of making a YouTube channel about it, I suppose. But that naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.